So today I'm going to be doing an art demonstration. This particular method is what I do for my eggshell paintings. So on my website has acrylic on canvas, acrylic on eggshells, acrylic on puzzle, drawing, oil pastel, sculpture. I have a lot of different mediums that I use, but acrylic on eggshell is one of my kind of original methods that I developed. I'm sure somebody else has done this in the past, but I did the idea actually when I was a teenager. I started working with eggshells just out of necessity because I didn't have art supplies, and it's kind of just a resourceful thought process. And then when I went through my Master of Fine Arts degree, I learned a lot about conservation and learned, the chemistry of art. And so what I'm doing, I've kind of elevated my process to archival standards. So here I'm gessoing a birch panel. So this is a wooden board. It's actually a cradle board, meaning that it is prevented from warping or protected from warping by being on a frame. It's almost like stretching a canvas, only the particular thin panel of wood is mounted on a square of other pieces of wood to essentially just create a protection and a base so that this piece does not warp over time. So the importance of gesso is that gesso will prime the wood. So wood is able to decompose, whether it's termites or something else, over time. 100 years later, this wood might not be here, but if you prime the surface with gesso, and especially if you double prime it, then you can actually peel that off, the actual artwork, and remount it on another wooden surface. So this is why it's conservation friendly and made to last for years and years. So what I've done after I gessoed the surface, and you could see that I was actually doing a brush gesso as well as a rubbing gesso. You can do either one or both. Then I'm going to, after it's dried really well, I'm sanding it. Now I actually use a nail file if I don't have really fine sandpaper on hand, because a nail file is just about the same as really fine sandpaper. You want to make sure that that entire surface is very smooth, because when we go to actually adhere the eggshells, we're going to want a very smooth surface. So the surface has to have like no bumps, no imperfections and that kind of thing. So once it's sanded and you kind of wipe that off, then we're going to go ahead and put a second layer of gesso on this cradle board. And once we've done a second layer of gesso on the panel and sanded that down, when it dries, then we're going to actually start to adhere our eggshells to the double gessoed panel. So I know this is tedious and it's a lot of work, not just to do, but of course it's almost tedious to even watch this process. So I hope that you have a little patience if you're interested in seeing the process, to watch the whole video. But anyway, I'm just going to go ahead and brush this gesso over the surface and all around the sides of this wooden panel one more time. And this is just going to create a really great coating, so that, like I said, if the wood does decompose over hundreds of years, you can actually remount this piece on another surface. And this also protects the eggshells because it kind of coats them by putting gesso underneath, and then we're going to actually put gesso on top and on the sides of the shells as well. So it really just wraps them in this archival coating. And then we're also using acrylic paints, which are archival in and of themselves, will not decompose. So this is just a very archival method and will last for years and years to come. So once I'm done double gessoing the panel and it's dried, we're going to get ready to start applying the eggshells. So after you have the nice smooth sanded and double gessoed surface of your wooden panel, we are going to take the eggshells in this process and crack the shell in a piece that's small enough to get it kind of, you know, positioned and adhered without having to have that glue dry. I also like to kind of make a shape that will go with where I'm going to place it. So this very first piece is going to be just placed in the corner like so, and that way we're going to start this eggshell process. And from there, once you place your first piece, it's just like building a puzzle. So what I have here is a little tin. It's actually a can of tuna that's still, you know, sealed. But I'm just using the outside of the tin for my adhesive. And this is a flexible, stretchable adhesive. And so I take the shell, and these are, of course, double cleaned eggshells. So they're cleaned and sanitized so that they are archival. And you're going to spread a nice amount of that adhesive on the shell and then position it on the surface. And you have to kind of control the process of when you crack it down, and you can see all those little cracks. You're going to then take your fingers and really carefully start to pull apart some of those cracks so that you will have cracks running in between areas of your painting. So I'm just gonna kind of separate those. You want to separate them on a somewhat even but also very like organic looking pattern. So that's how I've done that. And then after separating those, while the glue is still dry, I take a pencil, and this is just to roll that eggshell completely flat. So that way it's not going anywhere. You've got a completely flat surface, and you've got those shells spaced apart. Now you can also take a brush, and if there are any little teeny bits of eggshell dust, because sometimes when you crack it, there are just some little tiny particles, you can brush those off. And that is your first shell. And you can see it's completely flat on the surface. And then what we're going to do is take these other little pieces of the shell, and we're going to just piece them together and around. So with this little narrow part at the top, I'm going to go ahead and brush a little bit on the wood and then also on the shell for this one, just because it's a small piece here. So like I said, it's from a puzzle. It's kind of like a puzzle once you start with that first shell. And from there, you're just basically building all the way out. And this will look like a cracked painting when it's all done. So the process with placing the shell, brushing the adhesive on the back of the shell, rolling the shell out so that it's super flat, and spreading that shell out. And we're going to just continue to piece little shells, little bits of shells together across this whole surface. And this is a very time-consuming and super intricate process. It's basically like doing a mosaic, only in eggshells. And it's just white on white. So you've got white eggshells and you've got a white primed gessoed surface. And so all that you're really focusing on, you're not focused on color, you're focused on texture. And that really does help because it's all the same color. You can kind of focus on like the texture that you're creating with the cracks in the shells. And then we are going to turn this whole thing into, of course, a beautiful full color painting when we're done. But we want to focus on getting that under texture right. So we're going to just continue to take these shells And I always like to place them almost like when you're looking to see if a puzzle piece fits. Like you can place it and see, oh, okay, it would go that way a lot better than it would go this way, for example, because that would leave 2 gaps. So we're going to position that so that it goes with the flow of the eggshells that are already placed. I always find it kind of hard to talk while I'm working because I kind of hyper focus on what I'm actually doing. So that's why I do a lot of voiceovers in my videos, is because it's just easier to explain and talk when I'm not actually doing the work itself. One thing at a time. Some people are great at doing both. I always feel like I do my best work when I'm really just focused on the work. So once again, after you place that shell, then you're going to want to control how those cracks are going to run. So you're going to want to spread those cracks out. And then roll. You can really hear that roll. Now, if you do get any extra adhesive in there, you want to definitely get that out, because you don't want the adhesive to actually fill in the cracks or create a subtexture on top of the shells. So make sure that you kind of maintain the right amount of adhesive if you do want to try this process at home. I think it's just so pretty how those shells, kind of lay and piece together. And when I first started doing this technique, it was not even because of the aesthetic as much as like the concept and just the idea of piecing together parts of your life that are broken and trying to make sense of them. And that really resonated with me. And so I thought about eggshells as a metaphor for brokenness and for fragility in life, and also for kind of, the egg represents new life. So sometimes going through brokenness to get to like the next season in your life, or have a sort of like rebirth. So once again, I'm just placing that shell, as you can see, like right where it fits there. This whole process requires a lot of patience. It also makes people kind of double take in a gallery, because it's like, wait, what does that mean, painting on eggshells? And then when they realize it's actual eggshells that have been hand applied and pieced together, that also lends kind of like a caring touch to the whole piece. So it kind of is almost like a nurturing quality, to the concept of the particular painting, whatever the image content is about. So the very first piece I did on eggshells is called Taraja, which is the Kiswahili word for hope. And it was all about hope in the midst of brokenness, and the subject was a little girl in the Mississippi Delta. And I still love that piece. It's actually a very large piece, and it's about 3.5 feet by 2.5 feet or so. And then I've done some other pieces as well. One of the pieces I did is actually I should back up. The very first piece I did was not Taraja. That was the first painting I did on eggshells. But the first time I used eggshells was when I did a piece about Rwanda refugees. And That particular piece I created when I was in high school, and it actually hung at the United Nations headquarters in New York for a year on loan. And it was called In a Broken World, and once again the eggshells really symbolized, of course, brokenness in that piece. However, I didn't paint those eggshells. Those particular shells, I used the natural colors of different colors of chicken eggs that were like brown and green and tan, and basically to create kind of like shapes of continents and things in the background of a double portrait. So I'll have to show that piece as well as the Taraja piece in this video so that you can reference what I'm talking about. And then also I created a piece called She, which the name looks like Siddhi, but it's a Gaelic term for spirit, and it's kind of about femininity, about either freedom or control of women. And that also, yeah, in that particular piece, I felt like the eggshells were symbolic of fertility and femininity in a sense, you know. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit for you. So while I speed this up, I was just going to mention too that femininity, fertility, brokenness, fragility of life, new beginnings, new birth, and even just vulnerability are really all kind of metaphors for eggshells, and eggshells symbolize those things. So this is kind of, this looks like I made like no progress, but that's after that entire little time-lapse piece. So now I'm going to show you what it looks like with it all the way done, and you can see how those cracks are just running really organically. They're flowing. There are no big, huge gaps. There are no super tight areas. Everything is evenly spaced, but at the same time, not looking mechanical, looking very organic. So then what I'm going to do is gesso over all of those shells. So this process really seals the shells and creates a uniform surface so that the paint doesn't take differently to different parts of the shells. Like if you got a little bit of adhesive in an area or something, the paint would not adhere the same way as it would to an area without that adhesive. So the gesso just provides another coating, a primer that basically will give a uniform surface. In addition to that uniform surface for painting, you also want to have the gesso once again for that archival consideration to really coat the shells, because eggshells are an organic material. You want to make sure that even no matter how sterile and clean they are, that they are protected all the way around. 360 degrees around that shell is protected in an archival coating. So the gesso really does that. So I'm gessoing not just the top of the shells, but you can see that I'm really pushing that gesso in with a little bit of force all the way around the shells. So really the sides of the shells, the tops of the shells, and everything in between is really getting a good gesso coating. And you can see just how well those shells are really adhered down. Now I've used Aleene's fabric glue, meaning it's a flexible, stretchable glue. So if this particular piece was to get, say, impacted or crushed or hit with a hammer or something, those shells should, even if they break, new breaks, they should flex with that adhesive. And this gesso as a top coating also is holding them together from the top. And then ultimately the acrylic paint is also archival and will be another kind of unifying layer, in addition to, of course, creating ultimately the image itself. So now that that surface is fully gessoed all over the shells, surface and sides, I'm going to go ahead and do a toning of the panel and the shells. And the toning is basically just doing an underlayer. Now, in a regular canvas painting, you do this in order to kind of kill the white of the canvas, because colors show up better next to other colors as opposed to floating on top of white. So you want to definitely just, kill the white of the canvas with a color by toning it. with kind of a wash, like a diluted paint. In the case of my eggshell technique, what I do is I actually tone it a little bit darker just because I want the cracks to actually stay just the color of the tone. So what I'm doing is I am toning it all over, and then what I'm going to do is actually take a towel and wipe off the surface of the shells just to lighten that to what would be a more typical canvas tone, because the image is actually just going to be painted on the surface of the shells. It's not going to be painted into the cracks. So that's what's going to create the look of a cracked painting. So basically what I'm doing here is just doing a wash over the whole surface, but it's a very colorful wash. It's got quite a bit of pigment in it because once again, I want those cracks to be kind of blue. And in this particular piece, I am going to be doing a self-portrait. And the blue kind of represents sadness and pain, and I want that to read through the face. Blue is definitely not a natural color for a face, and so anytime you do blue or green and add that into a portrait, it adds like a little element of dissonance and an underlying question of like, what is the portrait about? What is the meaning behind it? You know, is it, you know, sad? Blue tends to represent sadness or loss or pain. And so that's kind of what this particular portrait is going to allude to. But at the same time, it's not just all gloom and doom. I'm actually going to paint a self-portrait with a reference photo of a selfie that I took that I am smiling in the particular piece, but you know, behind that smile is, of course, some hurt as well. So anyway, you can see I'm just pushing this color into those cracks and making sure that I give it several coats because I really want those cracks to run with that true kind of Windsor blue is what color this is. You can also use like a phthalo blue red shade, would be a similar color tone to this. So just making sure that there are no white areas left on the surface once this is done. And you can also tone the sides at this time if you want to, the sides of the panel. But we're just going to go ahead and make sure that all of these cracks are filled with the pigment of the paint and there are no more, you know, white cracks running through the piece. And then we're going to take, you can use actually a cotton towel or a paper towel and get that wet, and then we're going to just take that and clean off the pigment off of just the surface of the shells to prepare it for a drawing for the final painting. So you're probably going to need to re-wet your towel a couple times, and then this is what it looks like when those shells are cleaned off. You can still see, of course, that undertone of the blue, but the shells themselves are not fully pigmented, just the cracks. So once this is completed, I'm looking at the image. This is the image of the self-portrait that I want to use just as a reference photo. So I sketched that out onto the surface, and then I just completed the painting on the actual surface of the shells. So you can see that those cracks still run as that blue throughout the piece, but the painting itself, the portrait, is actually resting just on the surface of the shells themselves. So this just gives like a really beautiful, almost old world feel to the painting, no matter what the subject is. It kind of gives a classic feel, but also can allude to those metaphors like I talked about brokenness and vulnerability, pain, and things like that. So this is from the side. You can see that the sides are painted as well, just to finish it off. And then I'm also varnishing this with a satin varnish instead of a gloss varnish, because I really like how the satin varnish really shows off the almost like leathery quality of the eggshells. When you paint eggshells with acrylics, it just is a very kind of rich and sensual feel to the surface of the shells. So this is the varnish, and I am blow drying it, and you can see where it's shiny, it's just wet, but where it's not shiny, it's already dried. So that satin surface, you know, it's not glossy, it's not a gloss varnish, because it, once again, is just really kind of showing off the natural texture and properties of those eggshells. And I really enjoy just the prettiness of that blue, that Windsor blue that's running through the cracks. It's just a really pretty blue color underneath of the portrait. So this, once again, was the reference photo on the left for this portrait. However, as with any good portrait, you really want to extract more than just a copy of a photo or a copy of a subject. You really want to dig deeper into the soul of the person and, you know, express like that inner reality, that inner realm, looking inward into the subject. So hope you enjoyed this process of my eggshell painting method, and let me know if you have any other questions about it, questions or comments. I did have some requests for self-portraits, and I didn't have any, you know, available self-portraits, so that's why I chose the self-portrait as a theme for this particular project, and I will be loading it on my website, racheldolezal.com, if you're actually interested in purchasing this particular painting. But as always, check out the site if you would like signed prints of other pieces like the Taraja piece or the She piece, those two eggshell pieces. I have signed prints available on my website as well. So I hope you enjoyed this very tedious process of eggshell painting.